Guild Wars, Sea of Sorrows. Chapter 14. Shift the cords, cried Fasher, leaning over the banister of the quarterdeck. The sailors below saluted and ran to their posts, altering the rigging of the clipper as it slipped between two massive rocks. Fasher yelled, "1-2 hoist!" Kobaya watched from his post near the ship's wheel as his sailors climbed the high netting. The creaking took on a different tone as the sails shifted, letting the wind escape. It blew through the crevices of the ruined islands, lifting the ship over low coral reefs. For the first time in 3 days, Matcha wasn't at his side. Instead, she sat on the bowsprit like a strange, multicolored imp. She held an odd little telescope to her eye and a notebook in her lap, scribbling and muttering as the Pride drifted through shattered islets. Here and there, bubbles rose in foamy, sulphurous-smelling wafts, where heat from underground volcanoes welled up beneath the ocean. These made the tides even more dangerous as warm waters rose to collide with the cold currents of the open sea. Isay held the ship's wheel tightly, keeping her eyes forward and counting beneath her breath. She and Kobaya hadn't spoken in days, nor had Hence left her side, which was part of the reason. The Ascalonian stuck closer to Isay than her own shadow. The weight of the sails shifted as the yardarm settled into a new position. Fasher called to the men in the sails, "Belay your pull." "That's far enough." The dark-furred Char turned back toward the quarterdeck and yelled toward Isay, "Pilot? What's our heading?" "Our position's 21 minutes from the north latitude line," Matcha piped up. Fasher stared at her, and she began to explain her odd time distance north-south conversion. The moment she slowed her incomprehensible gibberish to take a breath, the first mate cut her off in desperation. "Hush, you crazy Asura. I don't care what the damn lat snoot is. I need to know our heading." The Shar turned toward Isay. "Pilot," Isay answered soberly, "north by northeast. Winds from the west at 6 knots. Matcha shot Isay an evil look. She hopped down from the bowsprit and tucked her notebook into a pocket of her robe. "How soon can we get that woman off the ship?" She growled to Kobaya. "Can't we just put her in a cannon and fire her at Divinity's reach?" "Masha," Kobaya scolded gently. "We need her." "Yeah, like a trephination patient needs a head cold." Kobaya shot the Asura an irritated glare. Matcha'd been moody lately, up and down, ranging from happy to snarky sometimes within minutes. She'd refused to talk about whatever was bothering her. Between the Asura and Isay, Kobaya felt as if he were walking on glass. "We should be sighting the Salma's Grace soon, Captain," Virid murmured at Kobaya's elbow. Matcha was unpredictable. Ayazai was angry. Henst was worse, and Sikox stayed below to keep the engines running, meaning that the creepy elementalist was the only one talking to Kahobia. That didn't make Kobaya feel better. If anything, it made him feel worse. "Any time now," Kobaya sighed. "It'll be dangerous, fighting in these shifting tides, but at least the Grace will be at a disadvantage. She's larger than the Pride, and these islets are narrow, hard to navigate." "Reefs," Virid mused. "If she strays from her path through the maze, the Creodan ship could tear out the bottom of her hull." He didn't seem either happy or sad about it, simply acknowledging a random truth. As he talked, Virid toyed with the wrappings that bound his arms, tugging them tight and then loosening them again in bored preparation. Kobaya caught glimpses of strange tattoos hidden beneath the black cloth strips. "She likes you, you know," Virid observed. "But he's going to cut your throat." Blinking in shock, Kobaya blurted, "What?" Before the elementalist could respond, the sailor in the crow's nest waved a bright red kerchief. That was the signal. All eyes turned toward the bow of the Pride. "There she is." Victory flashed in the Asura's black eyes as she lowered the telescope. "I did it." The Salma's Grace came into view. It was a massive galleon in the Creodan style, but fatter through the belly and lower in the water than any ship Kobai had seen before. Her hull was shaped of rich, old wood, a mahogany brown striped with golden whorls, and on her sails flew the strutting golden griffin of Divinity's Reach, the symbol of the royal family. Kobai counted 3 tall masts with 2 great sails each. A triangular jib hung so far at the stern that it lapped the rear of the ship and hung out over the waves. To the front, leaning out past the bowsprit, was a 4th mast, cocked at an angle and rigged to the foremast by a spider's web of rope. The rigging swung down on either side of her hull, making the ship seem for all the world as if she'd been draped in a cat's cradle of string. 10 guns were rolled out below the top deck, the portholes latched open as if they remained so at all times. But for all her beauty and all her more than 200 crew members, the standard on a galleon, and 4 times the number of sailors on the Pride, the Salma's Grace, moved like a wallowing pig. She was sluggish on her turns through the eyelet channels, and her sails were half stowed to prevent strong winds from accidentally running her aground. "Is it the gold that makes her ride so low in the waves?" suggested Fasher, greed dripping from his tone. Gold Kobai drew the cutlass from his belt and guns. He turned to face the rest of the crew and raised his voice above the wind. "There's our prey. Let's take her for our own." His cry was met with a resounding cheer, and the Pride turned slightly to her port and let her 6-pounders roar. Bursts of flame flashed along the side of the pinnace, and the thunder of cannon fire ricocheted off the chasm walls. The Salma's Grace was taken by surprise, with nowhere to turn, and the very rocks that had sheltered her now hemming her in. Holes tore through her hull just above the waterline. One of the Pride's gunmen was so accurate that a ball crashed directly through a porthole and destroyed one of the Salma's Grace's cannons in a single shot. Kobai whooped with glee. The Pride was prepared for battle, but the Salma's Grace was a sturdy ship. A few cannonballs wouldn't sink her outright. Kobai ordered the Char warband forward to the bow. "Ready, Virad?" The elementalist was standing by the gunwale with an absent smile. He nodded, and Kobai grinned even more widely. "Now!" Kobai yelled as the guns on the Creodon galleon sounded a return barrage. Her cannons were larger, broader, and more numerous, and their cannonballs were 10 pounds of iron shot, nearly twice the size of those from the Pride. But the Pride had something the Creodon ship didn't have: an elementalist. Virad raised his voice to summon a mighty wind spell as cannonballs burst through the cushion of smoke. As it had at Port Stalwart, the gale rushed forward to answer Virad's command. The spell served 2 purposes. First, it raised a wall of air before the armament of the Salma's Grace, shoving her cannonballs back down her throat. Second, the wind lifted the Pride's warband as they leapt from its bow. The Char arced up through the gunnery smoke like hunting hawks stooping upon their quarry. The sailors on the Salma's Grace had been trained in combat tactics. Each and every one of them was a member of the military. Their captain was a Creodon officer, and his personal guards were battle-hardened seraph. They'd drawn weapons, manned the guns, and responded to the threat with exacting discipline and obvious training. But they could not possibly have been prepared for 6 gigantic armored Char leaping from the smaller ship. The king's sailors fell back in shock and horror as Fasher, Sycox, and the rest of the Pride's warband burst through the smoke, landing with heavy thuds on the deck of the Salma's Grace. To their credit, only a few of the Creodon sailors broke ranks and outright fled. The rest stood their ground, courage shaken but unbroken. Sycox landed before the others of his warband, the engineer's impressive bulk pulling him to the deck first. A pistol in each hand, he unloaded a double shot of small arms, fire into his foes, blazing a trail for the rest of the Char to follow. When the guns were empty, Sycox cast them aside and bared his claws. Fasher alighted immediately after the engineer. His long sword flashed through the ranks of men defending the Salma's Grace, dropping one of them before any could react. The warrior Shar rocked on the balls of his feet, haunches bunching, and leapt to knock one of the deck guns aside. As Fashur's shoulder struck it with massive force, the carronade erupted into flame. The gun spun sideways. The shot misfired and blasted through the Salma's Grace's quarterdeck. The rest of the warband landed at last, claws extended, weapons ready. The youngest of them, golden-manned awesome Steamhawk, let out a battle cry and raced forward, tearing into the crew of the Creadan ship with abandon. Filled with bloodlust and battle fury, the Char laughed and called out to one another with vicious glee as they waded through their enemy. Hengst fought among them, for once ignoring the Char. His blades flashed like quicksilver. 2 of the Creadan sailors fell to his advance before they could draw their weapons. Even clustered together 4-1 against them, Creadan sailors were no match for the battle-hardened Char. But humans were not the only sailors on board. What in the mists happened to the ceiling? Someone bellowed from the middeck as 2 figures shoved their way up through the ruined boards. Massive by human standards, the men stood head and shoulders above even the Char. Salt gold hair capped broad, identical faces. Although those faces were the same, one wide jaw sported a long, braided beard, and the other had mutton chops and a thick mustache. "Oh no," Sycox groaned. "They hired Norn. Looks like twins, even. Are the ships close enough for the rest of the boarding party to get over here?" Vassar looked back over his shoulder. Shaking his head, the engineer answered, "Not yet." With a sigh, he crouched and readied his claws. This was going to be a much harder fight than anyone on the Pride had anticipated. "What, Char? A battle? Huh, that's a far better use of our time than guarding a rock-boring storeroom door," the bearded figure bellowed enthusiastically. "Bronn, my brother, remind me to thank King Bade for providing entertainment for our voyage." The second one soberly drew a massive 2-handed sword from his back, shifting it from one hand to the other as if it were no more than an oversized dagger. "I don't think the Creadan king had anything to do with it, Grim. These are pirates." Laughing, his companion replied, "Then remind me to thank the pirate." Grim, the Norn with the braided beard, strode forward and grabbed young Assam in his hands, grappling with the cat-like warrior without a trace of fear. Bronn paused to bellow a battle prayer. "May the spirits of the wild have mercy on your souls." He lowered his sword like a horseman's lance and charged Sycox with fire in his eyes. Sycox dodged the greatsword thrust with a quick sideways leap. As the mustached Norn passed, Sycox clawed him, landing a fierce blow that raked down Bronn's shoulder and left arm. The Norn roared in pain and returned the blow, lifting one hand from the sword and burying the fist in the side of Sycox's muzzle. Meanwhile, the bearded Grim lifted Assam entirely off the ground, wrapping his arms around the Char's arms and ribcage to give him a mighty squeeze. Assam cried out in pain, and Sycox heard a rib crack. Bronn tried to bring his sword across Sycox's belly, but the Char kicked the weapon aside. As the Norn lunged to retrieve it, the engineer called out to the other Norn, "Hey, Furface, you're picking on a cub?" Sycox snarled mockingly, "And here I thought Norn preferred a fair fight." Grim paused and looked carefully at the Char wriggling in his grip. "That's a fair argument," he said musingly. Smiling, he loosened his grip on young Assam. As the young warrior fell to the deck with a gasp, the Norn paused to pat the golden-furred Char's shoulder and give him a smile. "Sorry about that, mate. Didn't notice you were a bit overmatched. Been shut up too long, you know how it is." Assam didn't respond, unable to do anything but desperately draw breath back into his lungs. The Norn laughed. "I'll go pick on one of your larger friends." Spine grist, the Norn nodded in eager anticipation and strode away. "Leave it to Sycox to fight with his mouth instead of his claws," Mata grumbled. She peered through her little spyglass, watching the fight through the smoke of a second cannon volley. Her ears flicked, and she perked up, pausing her sweep of the other ship's deck. "Well, hello, pretty Kobaya," she called out. "I think I found their captain." She pointed, and soon Kobaya could see the man as well. He was older, stocky, and graying, wearing a sharply pressed frock coat of Creodan gold and green. The officer's coat reminded Kobaya of Captain Whiting, but the cold competency that radiated from him was nothing like the whining steward of the Indomitable's living days. This man showed no fear of battle. He strode into the fray and called on the sailors to rally, and rally they did. Kobaya noted a long scar down the right side of the captain's jaw. This man was no stranger to a fight. As he watched, the sailors on the vessel rallied around their captain, drawing strength from his mere presence. Indeed, there was something about the man, a strangely calm aura that bolstered his crew even against cannon fire, wind magic, and 6 furry murder machines. The captain of the Salma's Grace strode down the stairway onto the main deck, pulling loose a heavy spiked mace from its holster. His eyes narrowed as a char crewman tossed one of the Creodan sailors over the ship's side. Although Kobaya couldn't make out what he was saying, the look of disdain and anger on the Creodan captain's face spoke his thoughts as clearly as words. Fasher spun to face him, shifting his longsword in a figure 8 before him as he prepared for battle. The weapon never finished its maneuver. The captain of the Creodan ship swung his mace, calling out in a stentorian tone. As he did so, a brilliant orb of lightning crackled from his weapon, flying out from the end of his heavy mace and launching itself toward the char. The crackling sphere struck Fasher so hard that the quick-footed char was flung backward. He slammed into the mast with a painful yelp and slid to the deck, stunned. The Creodan captain raised his weapon and called out to the heavens. He brought it down with a loud rumble of thunder, and as he did, thick manacles of energy coalesced around Fasher's wrists. "What's he doing? What kind of magic is that?" Kobaya stared, snatching away Matcha's telescope to get a better look. "Is he a mesmer like you? Is that an illusion? Stop that!" "Hey!" Matcha leapt at him, trying to grab back her sighting glass. "Let me see. That's got to be an illusion, right?" "Right, Matcha?" One of the other char hurtled past the row of sailors, trying to fend him off, and dove between the captain and Fasser. It was Isam, young, wounded, and stubborn, his lion-like features shifting from battle courage to concern as the captain did not waver but stood in the path of his charge. Roaring, Isam shook out his pale mane and clawed the Creodan with all his strength. "Isam, no!" yelled Fasher. But the char youth was angry from his treatment at the hands of the Norn, and eager to redeem himself against a smaller human opponent. The captain pressed his mace to his chest and murmured softly. As Asam's claws tore toward him, a glittering golden shield surrounded the captain of the Salma's Grace in a protective shell. Isam struck the glowing light with his full weight, but the blow merely ricocheted away. He struck again, claws out, but he could not shatter or penetrate the magical defense. The Creodan captain smiled and continued to chant. "That's no illusion." Kobaya frowned. Matcha managed to wrest the spyglass away from him and thrust it to her own eye. With a frown, she considered the spectacle occurring on the far deck. It's a pile of Elonian protection magic mixed with a little monk training, wrapped up in some crazy ritualist hoo-ha from Cantha. A real grab bag of you can't hurt me. They're called guardians, and simply put, Matcha lowered the little telescope. They mean trouble. "I don't think the warband can handle that guy. What do you think we should do, Kobaya?" There was no answer. Matcha looked to either side, confused, but she was standing alone on the bow of the Pride. "Kobaya?" The captain of the Pride was already grabbing his ship's rigging, climbing so fast he seemed nearly a blur against the knotted rope. When he reached the top of the Pride's forward mast, Kobaya drew his knife and cut free one of the long ropes that tied the masts together. Before anyone could stop him, Kobaya leapt out and swung away. He spun over the pinnace, her white sails rippling beneath his feet, as the world tilted dizzyingly. The canyon wall careened toward him, and Kobaya slammed into it with both feet, using the leverage to push himself toward the Salma's grace. Where the Shar warriors knew how to use their bulk in battle, Kobaya's training as a child had taught him how to act quickly, with no waste of movement and an impeccable sense of balance. It was a skill that served him well aboard the Pride. The rope skidded through his hands, chafing the calloused skin. And when he reached the end, he shoved his legs against the stone, pushed off, and jumped for all he was worth. Everything spun as the weight of gravity took hold. Knife still in his hand, Kobaya plummeted into the galleon's mainsail. Deftly, he buried the blade into the white silks and rode the ripping sail down toward the Salma's grace. Across the deck, he could see Sikox and Old Grist fighting tenaciously against the twin Norn. They circled like hunting animals, feinting and striking with quick, sharp blows, while the Norn bellowed and laughed. Occasionally, Bron's greatsword lashed out in a circle, keeping them back while Grim taunted them good-naturedly. Kobaya couldn't help admiring the brothers' sense of strategy. If the Shars stayed at sword range, Bron's greatsword would cut them to pieces. If they came too close, Grim would grab and hold them, punching them with his titanic strength. These Norn might have been playing around, but they knew how to fight as a team. Kobaya slid down the sail, both hands desperately clutching the hilt of his knife. He could see scattered fighting all around, blurred by the smoke drifting in gray clouds from the ruined quarterdeck. Overall, the Pride's forces were winning. Several of the Creadan sailors were on the verge of surrender, dropping their weapons before the fury of the Char. The Pride's weaponry had caused damage, crashing holes through the outer hull and causing panic in the lower decks. Directly below, Kobaya watched as the Creadan captain swung his mace and knocked Awesome to the ground. Weary and wounded, the young Char still struggled to rise. But with another swipe, the captain's weapon cracked against Awesome's skull. The Golden Man Char fell limply to the deck. Fashor roared in fury. The grizzled old captain glanced down at the unconscious stripling and stepped over Awesome, lifting the mace as though to level another blow at Fashor's snarling muzzle. Kobaya saw Henst charging toward the captain, but the human was not close enough, or perhaps wasn't motivated enough to get there in time to save the Char. There was only one thing he could do. With a yell, Kobaya let go of the knife and dropped the last several feet, landing squarely on the Creadan's shoulders. As they tumbled onto the deck, Kobaya managed to wrest away the man's mace, sending it skittering across the dark boards. Henst kicked a weapon through the open hatch toward the hold. The two captains grappled, rolling together across the deck. Kobaya's fist cracked against the Creadan's jaw. The man threw Kobaya off and shook his head to clear it, reaching for another weapon. Kobaya attacked furiously, forcing the captain to defend himself rather than prepare for his own attack. Grasping the man's wrists as he struggled to stand, Kobaya brutally kicked the other man in the shins. The Creadan cursed a blue streak, falling to his face on the deck once more. Kobaya jumped on him, launching a quick 1-2 series of jabs to the man's face. But the older man wasn't finished yet. A strong right hook thumped into Kobaya's cheekbone with a shock of pain. Suddenly, the Creadan froze in Kobaya's grasp. A sharp length of steel slid past Kobaya's shoulder, its finely honed point pausing a mere breath above the Creadan captain's throat. With a rabid grin, Henst snarled, "Can I kill him?" The Creadan captain glared and raised his hands in surrender. No. Kobaya let go of his enemy and leaned back. "There's no reason to kill anyone, so long as the captain surrenders his vessel. We aren't here for blood." To the Creadan, he said more soberly, You have my word on that. None of your crew will be injured. Slowly, the gray-haired Creodan nodded, and the tension eased from his body. On my word of honor, I and my ship yield to you. But I tell you this, pirate, if you go back on that promise, we'll fight till every last one of us has cut his name in your sorry hide. I'd expect no less. Kobaya rose victoriously. Hence, go free Fasher and make sure Isam's all right. Then go tell those overeager Norn that the battle's over. We've gotten a formal surrender from Captain? He reached down to offer the Creodan a hand up. Moran. Captain Osh Moran. A sour look on his face, the older man took Kobaya's hand and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. 10 years younger, and I'd have had you. 10 years younger, and you'd have been fighting a stripling kid with no sea legs at all. Kobaya smiled, but the image of himself so many years ago brought back a painful memory. As he always did after a victory, Kobaya touched the old rag doll that was now tucked into the pocket of his vest. Vivian, he mused inwardly. Has it really been 10 years? Kobaya? Matcha called from the Pride, interrupting his reverie. She waved her arms and augmented her voice with magic so that he could hear her clearly. We have another problem. She flapped her arms, half dancing on the bowsprit. When she saw him looking, the Asura began to jab her fist to the north as if trying to shake something horrible off her sleeve. Staring at her curiously, Kobaya turned to look where Matcha was pointing. A third ship was approaching through the tall, jagged rocks of the ruined island chain. It was easy for Kobaya to recognize, despite the weariness of battle and the reflection of sunlight from the waves. He'd seen this vessel only once, but there was no other like it on the open sea. An ancient pilot clipper with scarlet sails. It's one of the dead ships. The blood drained from Kobaya's face. They found us.